298,000. That is the number the Japanese government expects to bury. It isn't an activist's guess or a foreign think tank's alarm bell, and it isn't the worst case a professor floated at a conference and nobody quoted again. It is the working figure published by the Cabinet Office's Central Disaster Management Council, updated in March of 2025, sitting inside a planning document that civil servants use to allocate concrete and coffins. 298,000 dead in a full Nankai Trough megaquake and tsunami. Revised down, actually, from 332,000. You are meant to hear the word revised and feel relieved. Now here is where the story turns strange, because a number that large, published by a bureaucracy that famously understates everything, is the kind of thing you would expect to see acted on. You'd expect emergency drills, a national conversation, a prime minister on television, something. Instead, it sits in a report, and the report sits on a shelf, and the country goes to work. And then, on the 8th of August, 2024, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck off the Huguenota coast, and the Japan Meteorological Agency did something it had never done before in the entire history of Japanese seismology. It issued a warning that did not exist the day before. A brand new category of public bulletin written into the agency's protocol for exactly this moment and never once used until that afternoon. The Nankai Trough Megaquake Advisory. Formally, in the language of the agency, Nankai Trough Earthquake Extra Information. It stayed in effect for 1 week, and it told the public, in careful, hedged, unmistakable language, that the probability of a much larger earthquake along a much longer stretch of sea floor was now higher than normal. Higher than normal. Not imminent, not tomorrow, not this month, necessarily. Just higher than normal. It is the strangest sentence a government has ever asked its citizens to live inside, and 30 million people along the Pacific coast of Japan spent a week doing exactly that. Then, the week ended, and the advisory expired. The trains kept running, life resumed, and nobody in a position to know has said, with any confidence, what the end of the advisory actually means. That is the story. Or rather, that is the doorway to the story, because the real question is not what happened in August of 2024. The real question is why a magnitude 7.1, which Japan absorbs the way a city absorbs a thunderstorm, produced a category of alarm that had been sitting in the drawer for decades, waiting. What is the advisory actually measuring? Because it is not measuring the quake that triggered it. And by the end of this, you will understand exactly what it is measuring, and why the smartest people in Japanese seismology cannot agree on whether the warning helped anyone at all, or whether it did something quietly, structurally, permanently worse. I'll tell you now, so you know where we're headed. There is a woman on a train in Kochi Prefecture on a Tuesday afternoon, and she knows a number to the meter. 14. Hold that. We come back to her in about half an hour, and when we do, the entire architecture of what the government is trying to tell its people is going to snap into a shape you did not see coming. If you want to be with me for that, the sensible thing to do is subscribe now, because this story is not finished. The advisory expired, but the trough did not. The instruments are still recording. The Cabinet Office is still revising. And I'll be honest with you, because that's the whole deal here. The most alarming thing I can say to you tonight is also the most conservative thing I can say to you tonight, because I'm not making anything up. I'm quoting the government. The scary version is the official version. One question for the comments, because it matters for the argument. When you hear 70 to 80% chance in the next 30 years, what do you actually do with that? Do you move? Do you shrug? Do you feel it in the room, or does it slide off? Tell me honestly. Because the whole second half of this film is about the science of that shrug, and whether the shrug is rational, and whether the country that has done more to prepare for earthquakes than any other country in human history has quietly discovered the ceiling of what preparation can do. By the end of tonight, you'll be able to look at a magnitude number and know why the digit on the left is a lie about the digit on the right. You'll know what a locked segment of subduction zone is doing while nothing appears to be happening. You'll know why the Shinkansen has never lost a passenger to an earthquake and why that fact is not the comfort it sounds like. And you'll know, in the quiet way you know things at the end of a long documentary, why the woman on the train in Kochi wakes up every Tuesday knowing the exact height of the wave that will reach her front step. Let's start with the number. 298,000 deaths, direct fatalities. That means people killed by shaking, by collapse, by fire, by drowning in a wave that, in the worst modeled case, reaches 34 meters, which is the height of a 10-story building rising vertically out of the sea and moving inland at the speed of a running car. It does not include the people who die of injuries in the weeks afterward. It does not include the people who die because a hospital ran out of dialysis. It does not include the elderly who freeze in a shelter in a coastal town in February because the shelter's power is out and the road to it is under seawater. 298,000 is the direct number. It is the floor. And that floor was revised down from 332,000, which was the figure the same agency published in 2014, after the trauma of Tohoku had rewritten every assumption the country held about how large its earthquakes could be. Revised down by 34,000, roughly the population of a small Japanese city. The revision itself is the size of a disaster, and it went almost unnoticed in the international press because it was reported as good news. Set that aside for a moment and consider the other number the Cabinet Office has published, the one that lives quietly alongside the death toll. 2 million buildings destroyed, not merely damaged, but destroyed. The estimate is that the shaking and the wave and the fire, working together, will render 2 million structures uninhabitable in a period of hours. To put a shape around what 2 million buildings looks like, it is the entire built stock of a mid-sized country. And the people who model this for a living, the engineers and the planners and the actuaries at the Japanese reinsurance firms, do not consider these figures alarmist. They consider them, if anything, a little conservative. The uncertainty in the estimate is not on the low side, it is on the high side. And then there is the probability. 70 to 80% in the next 30 years of a magnitude 8 to 9 class earthquake somewhere along the Nankai Trough. That number has been sitting in Japanese government publications for years. It is the product of a specific statistical method, one we come to shortly, and it has become the single most familiar disaster statistic in the country. School children have seen it in textbooks. Prefectural governors quote it in stump speeches. It appears on posters in train stations, on evacuation maps in the lobbies of coastal hotels, on the side of a bus in Wakayama. 70 to 80% in the next 30 years of a disaster that will kill 300,000 people. Read that back and notice that your face did not move. That's the whole problem. That's the entire reason the advisory exists. Because a number that large, delivered that steadily, over that many years, stops meaning anything. The mind cannot hold it. It isn't that people don't believe the government. Polling done in the Nankai coastal prefectures shows that most residents do believe the government's estimate, more or less, in a general sort of way. What they cannot do is act on it. There is no action that scales to a 70% probability of losing your city inside your children's lifetime. You cannot move. Your work is here, your parents are here, and the graves are here. So the number, verified and republished and stamped with the official seal, becomes the wallpaper of ordinary life. You walk past it every day, and after a while you don't see the pattern anymore. That is the environment into which the advisory landed on the 8th of August, 2024. A country marinated in the abstract knowledge that something catastrophic was very probably coming at some point to some part of the coast where roughly a third of its population lives. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, in the middle of the summer holiday season, the ground shook off the coast of Miyazaki, and the number on the seismograph came in at 7.1, and the Meteorological Agency's committee, which had been convened in a hurry, made a decision that had no precedent to guide it. They pulled the trigger on a warning nobody in the room had ever pulled before. The formal name is the one I mentioned, Nankai Trough Earthquake Extra Information, and it comes in tiers. The tier they issued that day was the middle one, not the highest. The highest is reserved for a scenario in which a magnitude 8 or greater has already occurred along the trough, and a second, comparable rupture is judged possible along the adjoining segment. That tier has never been used either. The middle tier, the one the country met for the first time in August, is for a situation in which a large earthquake has occurred in a related zone, adjacent to or connected with the main trough, and the agency's committee, after examining the data through the afternoon and evening, concludes that the probability of a full megaquake in the days that follow is higher than the baseline. Not high, just higher. The exact language matters, because it was crafted by people who understood that a mistranslation into public panic would cost lives. Naoshi Hirata, a seismologist involved in the framework, described the advisory afterward in terms so careful that the care itself became the story. It was not a prediction. It did not name a time. It did not name a location. It said, in essence, that the statistical ground under a specific week had shifted in a specific direction, and the appropriate response was heightened vigilance. Heightened vigilance in a country of 30 million people along the affected coast. What does that mean in practice? The Cabinet Office had a document for that. Some train services on Pacific-facing lines were suspended in the immediate hours after the advisory, and beaches in several prefectures closed. The Bon holiday travel, one of the largest internal migrations Japan has, went ahead in a modified form. Coastal hotels reported cancellations. Hardware stores in Kochi and Wakayama and Shizuoka sold out of bottled water and portable radios by the end of the weekend. Municipal offices ran emergency drills that had been scheduled for later in the year, and the Prime Minister canceled a trip to Central Asia. Then, 7 days after the advisory was issued, with no follow-up event on the trough, the Meteorological Agency lifted it. The bulletin ended, the trains resumed, and the beaches reopened at the tail end of the holiday. The question of what had actually just happened and what it had meant was left on the table like a dish nobody wanted to be the first to touch. That is the anomaly. That is the thing we have to explain, because the explanation is where the film gets uncomfortable. To understand why a magnitude 7.1 produced a warning that had been sitting unused for a generation, you have to understand what a 7.1 usually means in Japan. And to understand that, you have to understand the strangeness of a country that has organized itself, top to bottom, around the fact that the ground under it is not, in any meaningful sense, at rest. Japan records about 1,500 earthquakes of magnitude 3 or greater every year. Roughly 4 every day. Most are too small to feel. A few dozen are perceptible. A handful are strong enough to knock something off a shelf. 1 or 2 in a normal year are strong enough to close a road or crack a wall. The country's relationship with this is not one of anxiety. It is one of maintenance. In the same way, a person in a cold country owns a coat and does not think about the coat, a person in Japan lives inside a set of building codes and transportation protocols and civic reflexes and does not think about them. The building codes are the deepest layer. After the Great Hanshin earthquake in January of 1995, which killed more than 6,000 people in Kobe and revealed that a generation of older wooden houses and mid-century concrete structures were essentially death traps, the codes were revised and revised again, and the retrofitting program rolled through every prefecture in the country. The results are visible in the skyline. New buildings in Tokyo and Osaka aren't built to resist earthquakes the way an American building is built to resist a hurricane with sheer strength. They are built to absorb them. They flex, they dissipate. Base isolators, which are enormous laminated rubber bearings placed between a building and its foundation, allow the building to slide gently while the ground moves violently underneath it. Tuned mass dampers, which are pendulums or slabs of concrete hung inside the upper floors of tall towers, sway in the opposite direction to the building's own motion and cancel it out. The Tokyo Skytree, which at 634 meters is the tallest tower in the world, sits on a set of base isolators, and inside its central column runs a damping system inspired, according to its engineers, by the shinbashira of traditional Japanese pagodas, the free-swinging central pillar that lets a wooden 5-story pagoda absorb centuries of tremors without falling down. 900 years of pagoda engineering translated into steel and computer models, holding up a broadcasting antenna above Sumida. That is one layer. Underneath that is the transportation layer, which is the layer that gives the country its most quietly astonishing statistic. The Shinkansen, the bullet train, has been in operation since October of 1964. In the 6 decades since it started running, in a country that experiences roughly 90,000 earthquakes above magnitude 3 and dozens of significant ones, it has never lost a passenger to an earthquake. Not one. Ever. There have been derailments, and there has been damage to track and infrastructure. There has been a case, during the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, of trains stopped by an early detection system while the ground was still shaking. But no passenger has died on a moving Shinkansen because of a quake in 6 decades of continuous operation, in the most seismically active industrial nation on Earth. The way the system works is this. Along the coast and along the rail corridors, seismometers detect the primary wave of an earthquake, the small, fast wave that travels ahead of the destructive shaking. That primary wave arrives seconds before the shaking itself, and those seconds are enough. A signal fires. The trains, which are running at up to 320 kilometers an hour, brake automatically. They do not wait for a human decision. By the time the shaking arrives at the rails, the trains are slowing or stopped. The crash avoidance principle, the engineers call it. A country that assumes the ground will fail and builds around the assumption. And then there is the civic layer, which is the layer you cannot see in an engineering diagram. It is the drill. It is the poster on the classroom wall. It is the fact that a child in Kochi Prefecture, at the age of 6, has already been evacuated to higher ground half a dozen times and has been taught, without drama, that when the shaking starts, you do not check on your parents, you do not look for your bag, you go up. It is the fact that every coastal town has a designated evacuation route with the times printed on the signs, in minutes from the shore. It is the fact that the disaster budget, in a country whose disaster budget is by any comparison enormous, is not treated as a special expenditure. It is treated the way a household treats the electricity bill. Now hold all of that in your mind. Building codes revised after Kobe. Skyscrapers that flex like pagodas. Trains that stop themselves before the shaking arrives. Children who know the vertical meter reading of the ground under their school. The most seismically prepared civilization in human history, humming along inside its routine, absorbing 4 earthquakes a day without noticing. And now consider what it means, in that country, for a magnitude 7.1 to trigger a warning that has never been used before. Because a 7.1 in Japan is not, by the standards of Japanese history, a civilization-altering event. It is a serious earthquake. It closes roads, it knocks out power, and it kills, in a bad case, dozens or hundreds of people, and injures thousands, and it is remembered by name for a generation. But it does not, on its own, produce advisories that never existed before that day. The building codes are calibrated for it, the rails are calibrated for it, and the civic muscle is calibrated for it. If a 7.1 off the Huguenot coast, in a country this prepared, produced a warning drawn from a category that had been sitting in the drawer for years, then the warning was not about the 7.1. The warning was about what the 7.1 might mean. And to understand what a 7.1 off Huguenot might mean, you have to understand the piece of geography that sits offshore, running underneath the country, along the entire Pacific-facing spine of central and western Japan. You have to understand the Nankai Trough. You have to understand what is locked and what is loose, and what has been storing energy for how long, and how the pieces are connected to each other, and what happens when one segment moves while its neighbors have not moved for 140 years. We come to that. We come to all of it. But before we do, I want to plant something in your mind and then walk away from it, because there is a person inside this story who I want you to be able to see clearly when we return to her. And if I introduce her now, in passing, she will do more work later than she can do if I try to make her carry the whole argument at once. There is a rail line called the Tosa Kuroshio Railway. It runs along the Pacific-facing coast of Kochi Prefecture on the island of Shikoku, which is the smallest of the 4 main islands of Japan and the one that faces the trough most directly. The line hugs the coast, in and out of tunnels, and past small stations serving small towns, and the sea is often visible from the windows, close enough that on a clear day you can watch the fishing boats going out. On the platform of every station on that line, and on every station along that coast, in every prefecture that faces the trough, there is a sign. It is mandated by prefectural law. The sign displays 2 numbers. One is the elevation of that platform above sea level to the meter. The other is the projected height of the maximum tsunami wave that would reach that spot in the worst modeled Nankai scenario. The signs are not decorative. They are the outcome of a policy, and the policy is that citizens have the right to know the number to the meter. In the town of Kuroshio, on the western part of that coast, the number is high enough that the town has, in a way that would be considered unbearable in most countries, made peace with it. The town adopted a symbol some years ago that appears on its official documents and, in stylized form, on t-shirts sold at the local visitors center. The symbol is a numeral and a letter. 34M. 34 meters. That is the modeled maximum tsunami wave that could reach the town in a full Nankai megaquake. A wall of water the height of a 10-story building arriving from the sea, at speed, in the dark or in the light, on a Tuesday or on a Sunday, some year in the next 34 meters. The town wears the number the way a Marine wears a regimental patch, not with pride, exactly, but with something harder to name. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that the number is real, and there is no dignity in pretending otherwise. The town's mantra, as one local official has put it, is not that they will prevent the effects of the giant tsunami. They cannot prevent it. The mantra is a mindset. When it shakes, evacuate. That is the entire strategy. There is no other strategy, and there is no version in which the town holds. Now, imagine a woman on that train. She is in her 60s. She has lived in Kuroshio her entire life. Her mother lived there, and her mother's mother lived there, and her house is not on the water, but it is close enough that the number on the sign at her station has a specific meaning for her, which is that the wave, in the worst case, would reach her front step and go past it and take the ground floor of her house and, depending on the exact modeled scenario, either stop there or not stop there. She catches the train on Tuesdays because she goes to see her daughter, who lives in a town further along the coast. She sits by the window. She looks out at the sea. She has taken this train for years, and she knows every station, and she knows every elevation sign, and she can name the wave height at each of them without looking. Because when you have lived in Kochi long enough, the numbers are the way you locate yourself in space. She knows the number. She takes the train anyway. Hold that image. We will come back to her. And when we do, the question that will be sitting in the middle of this room is not whether she is being reckless, because she is not being reckless. The question is, what a country is supposed to say to her. What warning, what advisory, what statistical framework, what tier of extra information is supposed to reach a woman who already knows, to the meter, what is coming for her house. Because if the advisory in August of 2024 was for anyone, it was for her. And whether it reached her, and whether it should have reached her, and whether the way it was written helped her, or hurt her, or slid off her the way the 70% slid off everyone, is a question the seismologists themselves cannot answer. Which brings us finally to the thing under the water. The 800 kilometers of sea floor running from Suruga Bay near Mount Fuji to the Huguenota Sea off the western tip of Kyushu. 800 kilometers of subduction zone where the Philippine sea plate is diving underneath the plate that Japan sits on at a rate of a few centimeters a year. Slow and steady, almost imperceptible. Almost. It's the almost that will occupy us for the rest of tonight. A few centimeters a year. That's the whole story, and it's also the story that has to be pulled apart very carefully, because a few centimeters a year is exactly the kind of number that slides off a listener the way 70% slides off a train passenger. It sounds like nothing. Your fingernails grow faster than that, and the grass in your garden grows faster, and a glacier, in a bad year, moves faster too. But the fingernail is not locked. The grass is not under a continent. Here is what's actually happening under the Pacific coast of Japan, and I want to teach it as a physical thing first, before it becomes a frightening one, because the mechanism is genuinely extraordinary, and it deserves a minute of its own, before we let the dread back into the room. The Philippine sea plate is a slab of oceanic crust roughly the size of a small country, and it's moving northwest, and it's running into the edge of the Eurasian plate, which is the plate the main islands of Japan are sitting on. The two plates can't both occupy the same space. The oceanic plate is denser than the continental one, so it does what oceanic plates have done at continental margins for hundreds of millions of years. It goes underneath, bending downward at the trench and sliding beneath the plate above, and it keeps going down into the mantle. And somewhere hundreds of kilometers beneath the surface of Honshu, it eventually melts and returns, over geologic time, to the deep interior of the planet. That is subduction. It is the engine that made the Japanese islands, and it is the engine that will unmake parts of them. The Nankai Trough is the surface expression of this dive. It runs for roughly 900 kilometers along the Pacific coast, offshore, curving from Suruga Bay in the east, past the Kii Peninsula, down along the coast of Shikoku, and out into the Huguenota Sea off Kyushu in the west. If you looked at a bathymetric map, you would see it as a long, shallow scar in the seafloor, a wound that runs parallel to the coast at a distance ranging from about 100 kilometers offshore to, in some places, considerably less. That scar is the seam. It is where one plate meets the other, and one goes under. The rate of convergence, the actual speed at which the Philippine sea plate is diving beneath Japan, is approximately 4 to 7 centimeters per year. Call it 6 centimeters for the middle of the range, though the number varies along the length of the trough. 6 centimeters a year. In the time it takes a child to grow from their first birthday to their second, the plate has moved about the length of a chopstick. And now the part that matters. The plates do not slide smoothly against each other. If they did, if the plate simply glided under Japan at 6 centimeters a year, the way ice glides across a frozen pond, none of this would be a problem. There would be no earthquakes worth mentioning. There would be no tsunamis. The islands would sit on their edge of the plate boundary, and the Pacific plate would go under them, and nobody would ever notice. The problem is friction. The two surfaces are locked. Along most of the length of the Nankai Trough, at the depths where the rock is cold enough and the pressures are right, the interface between the plates is stuck. The plate underneath is still moving, because nothing has told the mantle to slow down. The oceanic slab keeps trying to dive at its 6 centimeters a year, but the surface where it meets the plate above isn't letting it. So the strain has to go somewhere, and where it goes is into the rock itself. The upper plate bends, and the lower plate bends, and both of them, over years and decades, deform elastically, the way a piece of wood bends before it breaks, storing the energy of the motion inside their own structure as a kind of geological savings account. Every year, 6 more centimeters of motion goes into that account, and then another 6, and then another 6, decade after decade. The account has been open, at the level relevant to the next event, for approximately 80 years. Do the arithmetic. 6 centimeters a year times 80 years. That is somewhere close to 5 meters of stored slip, locked into a fault system 900 kilometers long. 5 meters of unresolved motion, waiting to be paid back all at once, along a stretch of sea floor longer than the distance from London to Edinburgh. That is what a subduction megaquake is. It is not the ground shaking because of some abstract violence in the deep earth. It is the account being closed. It is decades of accumulated strain, released in seconds, along a fault surface the size of a small European country. The plates jump. The one that has been held back suddenly moves the distance it has been trying to move for a lifetime. The plate above, which has been dragged downward at its leading edge by the friction, springs upward and outward. And when a slab of sea floor larger than most nations rises by several meters in the space of a minute, it does not rise alone. It lifts the entire column of water above it. That's where the tsunami comes from. It isn't the earthquake, exactly. The tsunami is the ocean being displaced by a piece of the planet suddenly finding a new elevation. I want to sit for a moment with the fact that this is happening right now, and I don't mean metaphorically, I mean physically. As you're listening to this, along 900 kilometers of seafloor south of Japan, the Philippine sea plate is diving beneath the Eurasian plate at its usual few centimeters a year, and the interface, in most places, is locked, and the strain is going into the rock. There's no dramatic moment when the Earth begins to load. It's loaded. It has always been loaded, since the last one paid out. Every year it loads more, and every year it moves a little further along a curve that ends, eventually, in a release. Which brings us to the thing that is going to matter more than any other single fact in this video, and I want to introduce it now and flag it, because we will not come back to it fully for a while, and when we do come back, it is going to be the mechanism for the frightening part of this story. The Nankai Trough is not one fault. It is a system of segments. You can think of the 900 kilometers of subduction zone as a set of adjoining rooms in a very long house. Each room is a section of the plate interface with its own characteristics, its own frictional properties, its own history of rupture. In the east, near Suruga Bay, there is the Tokai segment. Moving westward, you cross into the Tonankai segment, off the Kii Peninsula. Further west, off Shikoku, is the Nankai segment proper. And further west still, off Kyushu, is the Hyuga-Nata segment. Different seismologists draw the internal boundaries slightly differently, and the terminology has shifted over the decades, but the essential picture is stable. The trough is compartmentalized. it has walls in it. And what the historical record shows, going back more than 1,000 years, is that these segments do not always break together. Sometimes one segment ruptures on its own. Sometimes two rupture at once. Sometimes a segment breaks, and then hours or days later, the neighboring segment breaks. Sometimes a segment breaks, and the neighbor holds for 2 years, and then breaks. And sometimes, more rarely and more terribly, the whole system goes at once, all of it, from Suruga Bay to Kyushu, in a single simultaneous rupture along the full length of the trough. The stress transferred by one rupture loads the next. That is the physics. When a segment breaks, the fault surface on either side of it, the rock beyond the edges of the rupture, has now had its stress state altered. In some cases, the neighboring segment is pushed closer to failure. In some cases, the trigger is nearly immediate. In some cases, it takes years for the loaded neighbor to catch up to its own breaking point. In some cases, the loading is not enough to trigger a rupture at all, and the neighbor sits, patient, absorbing the transferred stress and waiting. This is the segment coupling. I am flagging it now because the entire second half of the story we are telling tonight hinges on it, and if you remember only one technical idea from this video, remember this one. The Nankai Trough is a set of adjoining rooms, and when one room shakes, the walls of the neighboring rooms shake with it, and sometimes that shaking is enough to bring the neighbor down. Historically, when researchers look back at what the Nankai Trough has done over the past 1,300 years, they see this pattern over and over. Paired events. The Ansei sequence of the 1850s, where 2 enormous earthquakes broke different segments within about 32 hours of each other. The Showa sequence of the 1940s, which we will come back to in some detail later, where the Tonankai segment ruptured in 1944 and the Nankai segment ruptured in 1946, 18 months later. Sometimes the pairing is fast enough that the second event feels like an aftershock of the first, though it is enormous in its own right. Sometimes the pairing is slow enough that the second event arrives after most people have stopped waiting for it. And then there is 1607, or more precisely, the event that Japanese historical seismology dates to the 28th of October, 1607, in the 4th year of the Keicho era. The Keicho Nankaido earthquake. This is the largest recorded event in the Nankai Trough's history, and it appears, from the historical accounts, to have been a simultaneous rupture of nearly the entire trough. The tsunami it produced killed an estimated 5,000 people along the coasts of the affected region. 5,000 in the early 17th century, in a Japan whose coastline held a fraction of the population that lives there now, in an era when the villages along the Pacific coast were small and dispersed, and the great modern cities of Nagoya and Osaka were nowhere near the size they are today. 5,000 deaths from a coastline that today holds tens of millions. That is the baseline. That is the historical event, 400 years old, that the Cabinet Office's 300,000 is drawn from, scaled up to a modern Japan, where the same wave, along the same coast, meets a population and an infrastructure and an economy that did not exist when the last full trough event happened. Now, the honest broker's caveat, because we are going to be honest about this all the way through. There is real scholarly debate about the exact extent of the 1607 rupture. Some researchers think the entire trough went. Others think it was mostly the western half, with strong tsunami effects that made it seem larger. The historical record, based on chronicles kept by temples and local officials, is not the same thing as an instrumental seismogram. But the tsunami deposit surveys, the layers of sand and marine sediment washed inland and preserved in coastal wetlands, and later dug up by researchers with augers and sediment corers, confirm that whatever it was It was very big, and it was very wide, and it reached the shore with enormous force. And 1607 is not the only such event in the record. Working further back through sediment cores and the archives of temples and manors, researchers have identified evidence for a series of Nankai megaquakes stretching back to at least the late 7th century, roughly one every 100 to 200 years. Some of them were paired sequences, spread over hours or years. Some of them appear to have been full trough simultaneous ruptures. The pattern, as the seismologist Kenji Satake has put it, is a little different every time, and with current scientific knowledge, we do not know which pattern will happen next. Which is a very careful sentence from a very careful person, and I want you to notice how much is packed into it. He is not saying the next Nankai event is unpredictable, in the sense that we cannot know anything about it. He is saying that within the range of what a Nankai event has historically been, we do not have the resolution to say which type of event is coming: partial rupture, paired sequence, or the rare full-length simultaneous break. This matters enormously, and it is where the second big idea of the night comes in. The probability number. The 70 to 80%, updated in recent revisions to a range that includes 60 to 90% or higher over the next 30 years. This is the headline figure. It is the number that appears on every news story about Nankai, and it is the number the Cabinet Office uses to justify its planning scenarios, and it is the number that, once you have heard it a few times, tends to sit in your ear as a fixed and self-explanatory fact. It is not a self-explanatory fact. It is the output of a specific statistical model, fitted to a specific set of historical events using a specific set of assumptions. Pull any of those apart, and the number changes. The model in question is called Brownian passage time, and I promise this is the only place in this video I am going to name a piece of statistical machinery, because the mechanics of it are not the point. The point is what the model assumes. Brownian passage time treats the occurrence of large earthquakes on a fault as a process with a characteristic recurrence interval, plus some noise. You feed it the historical dates of the events, you feed it the elapsed time since the last one, and it gives you back a probability that the next event will occur within a given window. It is, at its heart, a way of quantifying the intuition that a fault which usually breaks every 100 years, and which is now well past 100 years since the last break, is probably closer to breaking than a fault which broke last decade. For Nankai, the historical recurrence interval is somewhere between roughly 90 and 150 years. The last full sequence, the Showa events of the 1940s, ended in 1946. That gives us approximately 80 years elapsed, which puts us solidly inside the historical window. The model, run with those inputs, produces the 70 to 80% figure that the government publishes. The chair of the Earthquake Research Committee, the seismologist Naoshi Hirata, has been unusually direct about what this number means. He has said that in essence, it should be understood as a signal that it would be no surprise if an earthquake were to happen at any time. That is a striking way to describe a probability. It is not the language of a forecast. It is the language of a warning. But here is the thing that starts, very slowly, to burn. The Brownian passage time model treats the sequence of past Nankai events as if they are all instances of the same underlying process, the same characteristic earthquake recurring with some variation on the same fault. And for many faults, that is a reasonable assumption. Some faults do produce fairly uniform earthquakes, cycle after cycle. But the geological record for Nankai does not look like that. It looks, instead, like a fault that produces at least two categorically different kinds of event. There are the partial ruptures and paired sequences, in which one or two segments break and the rest either follow later or hold. And there are the rare full-length simultaneous ruptures, in which the entire trough goes at once. These two kinds of event are not the same size. They are not the same duration. They do not produce the same tsunami. A paired sequence spread over 18 months, like the Showa events, produces 2 large earthquakes and 2 significant tsunamis, and they are terrible, and they kill people, but they are not the 300,000 death scenario. The 300,000 death scenario is the other kind of event, the simultaneous full trough break, something closer to 1607, or to the deeper historical events that appear to have ruptured the whole length at once. And here is the question that is going to sit with us for a while. Is the 70 to 80% counting the right kind of event? Because if you fit a model that assumes a characteristic recurrence to a fault that actually produces 2 different categories of event, the model does not know the difference. It sees a list of dates, it sees intervals, it averages, and it estimates, and it produces a probability. But the probability it produces is a probability of some Nankai event, some rupture along some part of the trough, of a size worth putting in the historical record. It is not a probability, specifically and separately, of the full trough simultaneous rupture that the Cabinet Office is modeling for its 300,000 deaths. The full trough event may operate on a different cycle. It may be rarer than the average recurrence interval suggests. It may cluster in ways that the model does not capture. It may be, in a sense that is very hard to quantify, a different animal than the events the statistics are averaging over. Nobody is claiming that the government's number is wrong, exactly. The people who built it are careful and honest, and have said explicitly, more than once, that it is a rough guide and not a precise forecast. Hirata's line about it being no surprise if it happens at any time is not the rhetoric of certainty. It is the rhetoric of a scientist trying to communicate a piece of information whose actual meaning is much more modest than the headline implies. But the headline is what travels. 70% in 30 years becomes a fact in the newspaper, and a fact in the ministry briefing, and a fact on the sign at the train station, and, eventually, a fact that either reaches the woman on the Kochi train, or, more likely, slides off her, along with all the other numbers, because a probability, no matter how carefully calculated, is not the same thing as a piece of information you can act on. And here is where the slow burn turns, for the first time tonight, into something with a specific shape. Because in August of 2024, the government did something that has never been done before. They looked at a magnitude 7.1 on the Hyuga-Nada segment at the western end of the trough, and they did not treat it as an isolated event. They treated it as a possible trigger. They issued the first ever Nankai Trough Earthquake Extra Information Advisory, the middle tier of a system that had existed on paper for years but had never actually been used in the real world. They told the public, in as many words, that for 1 week, the probability of a follow-on event, potentially much larger and potentially involving other segments of the trough, was elevated above the already high background rate. And the reason they did that, the reason a 7.1 earthquake at the western end of the trough was enough to trigger the first such advisory in Japanese history, is the segment coupling we have been circling all along. The Hyuga-Nada segment is not just any part of the trough. It is one of the segments that has historically preceded larger, coupled sequences elsewhere along the fault. When Hyuga-Nada moves, the accumulated stress on its neighbors changes. The rooms of the longhouse all shake a little, and the walls of the neighboring rooms all get a little closer to their own breaking point. And in a system that is already 80 years into an interseismic period, and already sitting well inside its historical window for a major event, the question that the advisory was implicitly asking was whether Hyuga-Nada had just fired the starting gun on the next full sequence. The specific historical evidence for this concern, and it is a piece of evidence I want to lay out cleanly, because it is the moment when the abstract mechanism becomes a concrete number and a concrete place, comes from the work of researchers who have been reading the sediment cores, and the tsunami deposit surveys along the Pacific coast for decades. Kenji Satake at the University of Tokyo and the teams around him have identified evidence in the coastal sediments of the Kii Peninsula of a tsunami with run-up heights in excess of 20 meters along the coast, tentatively dated to around 887, in an event now often called the Nina or Ninna earthquake. 20 meters of run-up is not the height of the wave at the coast. It is how high above sea level the water was pushed by the incoming surge. 20 meters is the roof of a 6-story building. 20 meters along a stretch of coast that is now among the most densely built and populated in Japan. That event, the 887 event, appears from the geological record to have involved a simultaneous rupture of most, if not all, of the Nankai Trough. It is not the event the 30-year probability model is primarily calibrated to, because the model is fitted to the more frequent partial and paired events for which we have better historical records. But it is the kind of event the Cabinet Office is modeling: the full trough simultaneous break, the Pacific-facing megatsunami arriving at the coast in as little as 3 minutes at the nearest points, the wall of water in Kuroshio. So, when the 7.1 hit Hugonada on the 8th of August, 2024, and the Japan Meteorological Agency looked at where it had happened and how it had happened, and what the historical record said about the role that segment had played in previous full sequences, they did not have the option of treating it as an ordinary earthquake. It was not an ordinary earthquake. It was a 7.1 on a specific piece of a specific fault whose behavior, according to the geological record read by the sediment corers and the tsunami surveyors, is one of the ways the largest events in Japanese history have started. And so, they issued the advisory. For 1 week, they told the country to be ready. And then, on the 15th of August, they ended the advisory. Nothing had happened. The follow-on earthquake, the coupled event, the cascade into the neighboring segments, had not arrived. The seismic activity at Hugonada had returned to what looked, from the outside, like normal background levels. And so the special caution period ended. The country was told, in careful language, that the elevated risk had subsided, that the advisory was being lifted, that ordinary preparedness remained appropriate, but the specific week-long heightened alert was over, which is, on its face, a rational and defensible piece of public policy. The advisory was tied to a specific window of elevated statistical concern. The window ended, and the concern, at that heightened level, ended with it. Officials were careful, when they made the announcement, to say that ending the advisory didn't mean the underlying risk had gone away. The trough was still loaded. The 80 years of accumulated strain were still in the rock, and the 70 to 80% 30-year probability was still the 70 to 80% 30-year probability. What had ended was the specific short-term elevation, nothing more and nothing less. But here is the question. The ending of the advisory quietly opened, and I want to leave it hanging in the room for a while before we come back to it. If the advisory was the right call when they issued it, what does ending it actually mean to the woman on the Kochi train? What is she supposed to do differently on the 15th of August than she was doing on the 14th? The number on the sign at her station has not changed. The wave, if it comes, has not agreed to postpone itself. The trough is doing what it was doing before the 7.1 and before the advisory and before any of us started paying attention, which is, quietly and imperceptibly, and at a rate of a few centimeters a year, storing up the energy for the next release. The advisory, it turns out, was not the beginning of the emergency. It was a moment when the emergency, which has been going on for 80 years, briefly became visible. And then the country was told to look away. Which brings us to the sequence of events in the mid-1940s, when the last full Nankai cycle actually closed out, in real time, in a country that had other problems. Because before we can talk about what the woman on the train is supposed to do with a warning that has already been withdrawn, we have to talk about what happened the last time this fault did what it does. The 7th of December, 1944, 1:35 in the afternoon, local time. The war was going badly for Japan, though the newspapers were not saying so in those words. The Imperial Navy had lost most of its carriers, the cities were being firebombed, and the rice ration had been cut, then cut again. On the industrial coast of central Honshu, in the belt of factories running from Nagoya down through Mie and out toward the Kii Peninsula, the war economy was doing what it could with what it had left. It was making aircraft engines and ship parts. The Mitsubishi plants at Nagoya were, on paper, producing the machines that were supposed to hold the perimeter that was, in fact, already collapsing. And then, at 1:35 in the afternoon, the ground moved. The rupture began offshore, on the Tonankai segment of the trough. The section directly beneath the industrial coast, the section that had last broken in the 17th century, the section whose stored slip had been accumulating quietly through every year of the 20th. Magnitude 8.1. That's not the full trough, and it isn't the largest event the fault is capable of. But it was a real, unambiguous, textbook subduction megaquake on the piece of the trough closest to the largest concentration of factories in the country. Buildings failed in Nagoya. Buildings failed in Yokkaichi. In the coastal towns of Mie Prefecture, and further east into what is now called Aichi, houses came down on top of the families still eating lunch inside them. And then the sea did what the sea does after that kind of shaking. It went out and it came back. The tsunami was not the 20-meter wave of the deep historical record. It was smaller than that, but it was tall enough, at the coast, to drown people who had not moved from the shoreline in the 90 seconds they had. The official death toll, as it eventually came to be recorded, was around 1,200. Some later estimates place it higher. The reason those numbers are approximate, 70 years later, is not because the record was lost. The record was suppressed. Under the wartime censorship laws, the imperial government made a decision within hours of the earthquake. The story would not be told, not in the newspapers, not on the radio, and not in any form that might reach beyond the affected prefectures or reach the Allies. The reasoning was tactical, and from a certain narrow military perspective, it was not stupid. A magnitude 8.1 directly under the aircraft factories, at that stage of that war, was strategic intelligence. If the Allies learned how badly Nagoya had been damaged, they would understand something about Japanese production capacity that Japan did not want them to understand. If domestic morale collapsed, the war effort would collapse with it. And so the order went out. Say nothing, print nothing, broadcast nothing. The dead would be buried, and the factories would be repaired, and the country would continue as if nothing had happened. The physical evidence of the earthquake did not cooperate with the censorship. In the coastal villages of Mie, people knew what had happened, because it had happened to them. In the towns further inland, people knew, because the roads told them. But the national conversation, the shared understanding, the sense that a disaster of this scale had occurred in a country already at the edge of its endurance, that was successfully suppressed. For the duration of the war, and for some time after, the Showa Tonankai earthquake was, officially, a thing that had not quite happened. There is a detail in this story that saves it from being only a story about state suppression, and it belongs here, because it is the kind of detail this whole video has been circling. In the coastal towns of Mie and Aichi, on the afternoon of the 7th of December, a significant number of people did the right thing. They felt the ground shake, they watched the sea recede, and they moved inland without being told to, without a bulletin, without a broadcast, because they had inherited the knowledge from grandparents and great-grandparents who had lived through the previous cycle. The Ansei events of the 1850s, the oral tradition, the local memory, the folk knowledge that had been passed down along the coast, the specific instruction that when the ground shakes hard and the sea pulls back, you go up. That knowledge saved lives on the 7th of December. The censorship did not save any. And the gap between those two things, between what the state suppressed and what the coast remembered, is the shape of a question that Japan is still asking itself 80 years later. There was a seismologist in Tokyo at that time who had been trying to tell his government that something like this was coming. His name was Kyu Wadati, and he was, by then, one of the founders of the discipline. He was the man who had first proposed, in the 1920s, that earthquakes originated at specific depths, and that the pattern of those depths described the shape of a descending slab of oceanic crust. The deep seismic zones that bear his name today, along with the American seismologist who described them independently, are Wadati-Benioff zones. He had spent his career watching the ground move. Through the late 1930s and into the early 1940s, Wadati had been arguing, in the kind of careful academic language that Japanese scientists of that generation used when they were sure of something, that the Nankai region was overdue. The historical pattern, as best it could be reconstructed from temple records and family diaries and the annals of coastal villages, suggested that the trough had a rhythm. The last full sequence had closed in the 1850s. That was, by the 1940s, nearly a century ago. The strain, whatever strain was, had to be going somewhere, and if the pattern held, it was going to come out in the lifetimes of the people then living. He was, in the technical sense, correct. On the 7th of December, 1944, he watched his prediction come true, and he watched his government suppress the news of it. There is no dramatic diary entry that has survived, no famous quote in which Wadati denounced the censorship. What survives is the shape of his work. He continued his surveys, he continued his measurements, and he kept publishing in the professional literature, where he could. And when the second earthquake came, 18 months later, he was still watching. The 21st of December, 1946, 4:19 in the morning. The war was over, the country was under Allied occupation, and the censorship laws had been dismantled, and the Trough, having released the Tonankai segment in 1944, released the Nankai segment now. Magnitude 8.0. The rupture propagated westward from where the first one had stopped, unzipping the next piece of the fault, doing exactly what the historical record suggested it would do. Roughly 1,300 to 1,400 people died. The coastal towns of Wakayama and Tokushima and Kochi took the tsunami. The wave came into the same bays it had come into in 1854 and in 1707 and in 1498 and every one of the times before that, which the sediments record and the temple stones remember. The wave did not care that the government had changed. The wave did not care that the war was over. The wave arrived on the schedule it had been keeping for as long as there had been anyone on that coast to notice. And this time, the news was not suppressed. This time, the country was allowed to grieve out loud. The photographs exist. The survey reports were filed and published. Wadati and his colleagues walked the coast, taking measurements, marking the run-up lines, doing the work of turning a disaster into data that could be used the next time. The maps that the Cabinet Office publishes today, the ones with the 34-meter line drawn along the Kochi coast, are built on foundations that Wadati and his generation laid in the winters of 1944 and 1946. Sit with that for a moment. The last full closure of the Nankai cycle happened inside living memory. There are still people alive in Japan today who were children in those coastal towns when the sea came in. Not many, and they are in their 80s and 90s now. But they exist. When the Cabinet Office says the 70 to 80% probability applies to the next 30 years, that is not an abstraction. It is a bet against the lifespan of a specific generation. The generation whose parents survived the last one is being told, in the language of statistics, that their children will probably see the next one. And so the question, when you look at 1944 and 1946 together, and you look at what the state did and did not do, and you look at what the coast remembered and what the coast forgot, becomes uncomfortably specific. In 1944, the suppression was overt. There were censors, and there were laws, and there was a stated military rationale, and it is easy, from 80 years away, to identify it as suppression and to condemn it as such. The state told the country not to look, and the country, insofar as it could, did not look, and people died who might not have. The question the ending of the 2024 advisory quietly asked is what the modern equivalent of that suppression is. It isn't censorship, because nobody is being told to be silent. The Japan Meteorological Agency publishes its data, the Cabinet Office publishes its models, and the prefectural governments publish their evacuation maps. The information is not being withheld. But there is a version of suppression that does not require withholding, and it is worth naming. It is the version in which the information is available, but the moment at which the information is emotionally alive is deliberately closed. The advisory ran for a week. Then it ended. The country was told, in careful language, that it could now stop paying quite so much attention, and the coast, which had been briefly holding its breath, was told it could breathe out. That is not the same as censorship, but it is not nothing. And if you were the woman on the Kochi train on the 15th of August, 2024, the difference between what your government was doing and what Wadati's government did in 1944 would have been a matter of degree, not a matter of kind. The wave, if it comes, will not know which era of Japanese governance issued the last bulletin, which returns us, at last, to the fragment we planted a long time ago, and to the woman on the train. She takes the Tuesday train because she has an appointment in the next town over. That is the part of her routine that has not been described until now, because it did not need to be. She has a doctor she has been seeing for years. She goes on Tuesdays. She has been doing it long enough that the station staff know her, and she knows the station staff, and the ticket takes itself out of the machine without her thinking about it. She knows the sign on the platform, the height above sea level, the projected wave. She has known those numbers for so long that they have stopped being frightening in the immediate sense and become, instead, part of the furniture of her life. The way a person who lives near a river knows how high the river gets in a bad year and does not think about it every morning, but does not forget it either. What is worth understanding, because the Cabinet Office has published the numbers and they are freely available, is what the woman also knows about time. Kochi Prefecture makes the tsunami travel time estimates public. They are on the laminated cards. They are on the posters at the stations. They are in the pamphlets you can pick up at the community center and at the town hall and at the school. The estimates are specific. At the nearest Pacific-facing points on the Kochi coast, a full Nankai tsunami arrives approximately 3 minutes after the shaking stops. 3 minutes. Read that number twice. 3 minutes is not the time from the start of the earthquake. 3 minutes is the time from the end of it. The shaking in a full Nankai event is expected to last for several minutes on its own. You will feel the ground move, and it will keep moving, and you will not know when it is going to stop, and you will not know, until it stops, what part of the sequence is the earthquake and what part is the wave beginning to arrive. And when it does stop, and you can stand up again, and you can look around and see what has happened to the building you were in, and to the platform you were on, and to the road you would have used, you have, at the nearest coastal points, 3 minutes. 3 minutes is not enough time to reach high ground on foot from a low-lying coastal station. It is not enough time to drive out of town. It is not enough time, in most cases, to do anything you would recognize as a proper evacuation. Kochi Prefecture has done the maths on this, coldly and publicly, and the math said that any evacuation plan that assumes people can move inland in the available window is a plan that will kill them. So Kochi Prefecture built up. Along the coast, in the towns where the flat land runs to the water and there is nothing tall enough to climb, the prefecture has constructed a network of vertical evacuation towers, Tsunami Hinan Tower in Japanese. Steel structures, engineered specifically for this purpose, rising 10 to 15 meters above ground level, designed with open lattice sides so that a wave of the right height passes through the tower's lower stories rather than knocking the tower down. Stairs on the outside, a platform at the top big enough to hold a village. They are painted, some of them, in bright colors, so that when the shaking has just stopped and your eyes are still trying to focus and the world is still tilting slightly, you can see them from anywhere in the town. The specification, at design, was that a person of ordinary mobility should be able to reach the nearest tower within 90 seconds. That is what the geometry of the network was built around. 90 seconds to the tower, 90 seconds to the base of the stairs. Then the climb, which was designed to be doable by a person in their 70s, carrying a small child, in the dark, in the rain, with the ground still trembling. The woman knows where the nearest tower is. She has walked the route. She has, at some point in the last several years, timed it. The route from her platform, to the exit, to the street, to the base of the stairs. She knows how many steps it takes. She knows the corners. She knows which way she will turn out of the station. And she has done this in the way that a person who has taken a route many times knows it, without having to think about it, so that if the moment ever comes, she will not have to think about it either. Her body will simply go. That is what correct preparation looks like. That is what it means, in practical terms, to live on that coast and to have taken the situation seriously. She has done the reading. She has looked at the numbers. She has walked the routes. She has, in the private way that people in Kochi have of not talking about it, made peace with the fact that the Tuesday train might one day be the train she was on when it happened. And the honest answer, the answer the Cabinet Office's own modeling produces, is that all of that correct preparation reduces the death toll, but does not eliminate it. The 298,000 figure is not a worst case in the sense of nobody having done any preparation. It is a worst case that already incorporates the evacuation towers, the drills, the signs, the laminated cards, the school programs, the Shinkansen braking, the base isolators, the tuned mass dampers. It is the number that comes out of the models after all of that has already been factored in. It is what you get, roughly, when a coastline this exposed is struck by a wave this tall, at a coast this developed, even after every reasonable mitigation has been applied. Which is the coldest thing about the number, and I want to say it plainly, because the softer version is a form of the same suppression we have been talking about. The woman on the Kochi train has done everything correctly. She will, in the event, most likely reach the tower. The system was built for her. But the system was not built to save everyone, because on that geometry, with that wave, on that coast, it cannot be. There will be people in the buildings that come down before the wave even gets there. There will be people in the fires that follow the shaking, in the parts of the country that will not be told to expect a wave because they are not on the coast, but where the ground has still failed. There will be people in the hospitals whose power will not come back on for weeks and who cannot be moved. There will be people in the small ports and the isolated villages who will be, when the shaking stops, 3 minutes from the water and 8 kilometers from the nearest tower. 298,000. The number is not a failure of preparation. It is what preparation, applied honestly and thoroughly, has been able to reduce the number to. And that is the gap. If individuals have done the work, and the towers have been built, and the drills have been run, and the number is still what it is, the gap is not at the level of the individual or the community. The gap is somewhere else, somewhere in the seam between what a person can do and what a wave can do, and what a coast that has already been built, where it has been built, is now committed to. We will come back to that seam. It is where the reversal will eventually happen. For now, hold the woman in mind, on the Tuesday train, on the seat by the window, with the sea flashing past on her left. The number on the sign has not moved. Neither has she. There is another way to look at all of this, and it is worth spending a little time on, because if the last hour has been dread, then a certain amount of what comes next has to be something else, and the trough itself is, in a way that has nothing to do with catastrophe, one of the most astonishing pieces of physics on the planet. Consider what is actually there, right now, in the water, doing its work. On the sea floor above the Nankai Trough, at depths of 1,000 meters in some places and 4,000 in others, there is a network of instruments called DONET, the Dense Ocean Floor Network System for Earthquakes and Tsunamis. It is the kind of engineering that, 20 years ago, was still being sketched on whiteboards by people who were not sure it could be built. Now it is on the bottom of the Pacific, and it is on all the time. More than 50 seafloor observatory nodes, and roughly 320 kilometers of fiber optic cable laid across the bottom, connecting the nodes to each other and to the shore. At each node, a set of instruments so sensitive that they can feel the ground breathe. Broadband seismometers, so that a wave arriving from anywhere in the world can be identified by its shape. Accelerometers, for the local shaking. Precision pressure gauges, which can detect the passing of a tsunami as a change in the weight of the water above them. Temperature sensors, hydrophones, the lot. The cable runs to shore. The data comes into the observatory facilities in real time. There is no waiting for a ship to go out and retrieve the recordings. There is no batch processing. The system is live. If a wave passes over one of those pressure gauges tonight, the shore stations will know about it in the moment it happens, and the tsunami warning that goes out to the coastal towns will be built on the data from the wave itself, not on a model of a wave that might have been made by an earthquake that might have happened. Every few hours, if you were the kind of person who could read the data, you could pull up a picture of the tectonic stress field under a significant part of the Pacific. The nodes are dense enough, and the instruments are sensitive enough, that patterns emerge. The trough is not silent between the big events. It is not sitting there like a rubber band being stretched, waiting for the snap. It is doing something much stranger and more interesting than that. It is creeping, and it is breathing. On parts of the interface between the plates, at certain depths, at certain temperatures, at certain pressures, there is an ongoing process of slow slip. The rock does not lock and hold and then release all at once. It moves, in some places, at rates that are too slow to produce shaking you can feel, but that are fast enough to be measured. An episodic silent slip, sometimes lasting days, sometimes lasting weeks, in which a patch of the fault will quietly displace by a few millimeters or a few centimeters, without ever announcing itself as an earthquake. The DONET instruments can see it. So can the borehole strain meters. So can the GPS stations on the islands, and the tilt meters, and the whole apparatus of the modern subduction observatory. What you get when you put all of that together, is a picture of a fault that is alive, and not in a metaphorical sense. It's alive in the specific, physical sense that it is moving, all the time, in ways that were completely invisible until this decade, and that are now recorded at intervals of hours. Sometimes the slow slip events are accompanied by other signals. Very low-frequency earthquakes, which are events that release energy at frequencies far below what a normal earthquake produces. Non-volcanic tremor, which is a kind of persistent shivering of the ground at depth, thought to be caused by fluids moving through the fault system under high pressure. The trough is not just a plate boundary, it is a plumbing system. Water is being carried down by the descending slab. Water is being cooked out of the descending sediments by the heat and the pressure. Water is finding its way into cracks and lubricating surfaces and altering the friction on the interface in ways that scientists are only now beginning to understand. Think about that for a moment. There is a sea beneath the sea. The Pacific is above the trough, and within the trough, at depths of tens of kilometers, there is water being wrung out of rock, and moving, and pooling, and escaping, and the movement of that hidden water is part of what determines whether and when the fault will slip. The instruments that are listening for the next great earthquake are, incidentally, listening to a hydrological system in the crust that operates on time scales of years and geometries measured in tens of kilometers, and that nobody knew existed in this detail before the instruments were dense enough to hear it. The scientific question that this opens is genuinely open, and it is one of the most interesting questions in the earth sciences right now. If the trough is creeping in some places and locked in others, and if the creeping releases stress, does that stress just go away? Or does it get transferred to the locked patches, which then have to bear the burden that the creeping patches will not? The honest answer is that different research groups, with different data sets and different assumptions, will give you different answers. Some argue that slow slip is, on balance, a stress reliever. It bleeds off energy that would otherwise have to come out in a great earthquake. Others argue that it is a stress loader. It transfers energy to the neighboring locked patches, and it may in fact be one of the mechanisms by which those patches are being brought closer to their failure point. Both positions are defensible. Both are being actively researched. We will come back to that disagreement because it is one of the central live scientific arguments about this fault, and it is worth spending real time on. But for the moment, sit with the fact that we know it is happening. 20 years ago, we did not. We thought the trough was quiet between the big ones. We now know it is not, and the knowing is the product of an infrastructure project that put over 50 scientific instruments on the deep floor of the Pacific, connected them with hundreds of kilometers of glass fiber, and left them running. The trough is not waiting silently. It is talking all the time, in signals that human beings did not have the ears to hear until this decade. That is genuinely astonishing, and it has nothing in this moment to do with what will happen to the coast of Kochi. It is just a fact about the planet that we did not know before, and that we now know, and that is worth stopping to appreciate before the next hard thing. Now, the hard thing. Because knowing a fault is talking is not the same as knowing what it's saying, and the moment you tell the public that scientists can hear something they could not hear before, a certain kind of story rushes in to fill the space that the uncertainty leaves open. I want to spend a few minutes on those stories because I think they deserve to be taken seriously before they're taken apart. They didn't appear from nowhere. They appeared because there's a real gap between what people are being told and what people believe they're being told, and that gap has a history. In the days after the 8th of August 2024, when the Japan Meteorological Agency issued the advisory, the internet did what the internet does. Someone noticed that Japanese authorities had, at various points, moved cleanup equipment near the Fukushima Daiichi site. Somebody else pointed out that a U.S. Navy exercise had been conducted in the region earlier that summer. Somebody with a large following posted that the timing of the advisory was suspiciously convenient for a government that wanted to distract attention from ongoing wastewater discharges into the Pacific. And within about 72 hours, the theories had taken their familiar shape. The advisory was cover. The earthquake was not natural. Somebody had done something under the water, and the government of Japan was using a geological warning to hide it. Now, I understand the instinct. I really do. Because the historical record of the government of Japan and the truth is not clean. We spent an entire section of this story on the fact that when the Tonankai earthquake killed 1,200 people in 1944, the imperial government sat on the casualty figures for the duration of the war. That is not a rumor, not conjecture. That is what happened. The seismograph traces exist. The suppression is documented. There are people alive today whose grandparents buried their dead in secret because the state told them their grief was a military liability. And after Fukushima in 2011, the public trust in institutional announcements about disaster took a hit from which it has not fully recovered. TEPCO's early statements about the state of the reactors were, to put it as generously as possible, not what the reality on the ground turned out to be. The word meltdown was avoided for weeks. Radiation readings were reported in units that made comparison difficult. Officials, in televised briefings, said things that turned out to be untrue, and in some cases turned out to be things they'd known were untrue when they said them. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is what the subsequent inquiries found. So, when a Japanese citizen, in 2024, hears a government announcement about an earthquake advisory and thinks, wait, what are they not telling me? That is not a stupid reaction. It's a learned one. It's a rational response to a documented pattern. The kernel is real, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But here's where the theory has to be taken apart, because the theory has moved from a reasonable suspicion of institutional dishonesty to a specific claim about physics, and the specific claim about physics is where the whole thing falls down. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake, of the kind that struck off Hyuga-Nada on the 8th of August, releases approximately 2 × 10 to the power of 22 joules of energy. That's a number that is very difficult to hold in your head, so let me give it to you a different way. If you took every nuclear weapon currently held by every nuclear power on the planet, the combined arsenals of the United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, and you detonated all of them simultaneously in one spot underground, you would not equal the energy released by a magnitude 7.1 earthquake. You would be somewhere in the neighborhood, but you would not exceed it, and depending on which estimate of arsenal yields you use, you might well fall short. And a magnitude 7.1 in the context of the Nankai Trough is small. It's the smaller end of what this fault is capable of. The full trough scenario the Cabinet Office plans around is a magnitude 9. A magnitude 9 releases something like 1,000 times the energy of a magnitude 7. That is not what human beings can do. That is not what any weapons program, disclosed or undisclosed, could produce. The failure in every one of these theories is the same failure. It's a failure to respect scale. There's no scalar weapon that produces a magnitude 7. There's no directed energy device that can dump 22 orders of magnitude of joules into a subduction zone. HAARP, which is the ionospheric research facility that has served as the villain of 1,000 internet posts, produces radio waves. It cannot produce earthquakes. It cannot cause faults to slip. The physics isn't marginal or close. The physics is absent. And the reason the physics is absent is that faults are pushed by the movement of tectonic plates, and tectonic plates are pushed by convection currents in the mantle of the Earth, and those currents involve energies and masses that no human artifact will ever come close to matching. The Philippine Sea Plate is moving northwest at 6 centimeters a year, and the force behind that movement is the slow overturning of the interior of a planet. You cannot trigger that with a bomb. You cannot trigger it with a signal. You cannot trigger it, full stop. So I'm going to kill this theory the way it should be killed, which is not with contempt and not with the standard debunker's sneer, but with the scale of the thing itself. When you find yourself considering the possibility that a government agency, or a foreign power, or a hidden program has produced an earthquake, ask yourself what number of joules that would require, and then ask yourself where those joules are supposed to have come from. The answer is always the same. There is no such source. The planet itself is the source, and the planet does not ask permission. But that theory isn't wrong because it's too strange. It's wrong because it's not strange enough. The real argument going on right now about the Nankai Trough and the advisory system and what the state should and should not be telling the public is stranger, and the people having it are not conspiracy theorists on message boards. They're seismologists and disaster communication researchers, and they're publishing peer-reviewed papers, and they don't agree with each other, and the disagreement is about something much more interesting than whether the government is hiding a weapons test. The disagreement is about whether the government, by telling the truth, is inadvertently making things worse. Let me lay it out. On one side, you have Shigeko Horiuchi, whose work on the 2011 Tohoku disaster and the years that followed has become one of the more difficult bodies of research to sit with, because it argues for something that intuition resists. Her finding, put simply, is that people who have been through repeated warnings that did not result in the predicted event become, over time, less responsive to warnings in general. This is not a moral failing on the part of those people. It's a cognitive one, and it's structural, and it's well documented across multiple disaster types and multiple countries. If you tell someone often enough that a wave might be coming, and no wave comes, then when a wave actually comes, the message no longer produces the behavior it was designed to produce. The evacuation is slower. The compliance is lower. The people who die are, disproportionately, people who had heard the warning many times before and had come to treat it as background noise. The name for this in the literature is the cry wolf effect, from the Aesop fable, and it's not a novel concern. It's a well-documented finding. What Horiuchi has argued, in the specific context of the Nankai Trough advisory, is that a system designed to communicate elevated probability during interseismic stress windows may, over the course of decades, degrade the population's response to acute warnings when they eventually come. The advisory of August 2024 was issued for 1 week and then withdrawn. No great earthquake followed. In the framework Horiuchi has spent her career developing, that outcome is not a success. It's a data point on the cost side of a ledger that has real casualties on it. On the other side, you have Kenji Hirata, who's the deputy director of the Earthquake and Volcano Research Department at the Japan Meteorological Agency, which is the body that issued the advisory. His position, stated in the technical briefings that followed the withdrawal, is that Horiuchi and researchers like her are measuring the wrong thing. The purpose of the advisory system, in Hirata's account, isn't to produce immediate evacuation. Immediate evacuation, in response to a probabilistic elevation rather than an imminent event, would be a policy mistake. What the system is designed to do is to raise the population's baseline awareness during periods when the statistics say the fault is more likely than usual to break. It's meant to prompt people to check their supplies, to review their evacuation routes, to have the conversation with their families that they've been meaning to have. It's meant to move behavior along a much longer timescale than a single week, and to measure its success by whether the population is better prepared when the great earthquake finally arrives, whenever that is. Both of these positions are defensible. Both are held by serious people who've read the same research and reached different conclusions. And the argument between them isn't going to be resolved by more theorizing. It's going to be resolved by the next advisory, and by whether the behavioral data from that advisory shows a population that's better prepared or a population that has learned to shrug. I'll tell you where I lean, and I'll tell you why, and I'll tell you exactly what would change my mind. I lean toward Horiuchi's concern, and I lean toward it because the cost of being wrong on that side of the argument is measurable in specific human beings who don't leave their houses when the wave is coming. The cost of being wrong on Hirata's side is a longer-term degradation of preparedness, which is bad, but which doesn't concentrate its damage into the 90 seconds when the ground stops shaking and the choice to run or not to run gets made. The compliance gap is where people drown, and the compliance gap is what the cry wolf literature keeps finding in study after study, in country after country. What would change my mind is a second advisory event followed by measurable behavioral data. If a second advisory is issued, and the analysis of that advisory shows a population that responded with heightened preparation rather than reduced attention, then Hirata's model is doing what he says it's doing, and I would revise my position. If a second advisory is issued, and the population responds with visibly reduced attentiveness, or with the specific kind of fatigue that Horiuchi's work predicts, then the concern is confirmed and the system needs to change. Right now, we have exactly one advisory to work with. One data point is not enough to settle anything. The debate is unresolved because reality has not resolved it, and it will not resolve until the trough gives us another chance to watch how people respond. And I want to be careful here, because there's a version of this argument that turns into a debate about whether the state should be telling the public anything at all, and that's not the debate that's actually happening. Nobody in the serious literature is arguing that the population of Kochi and Wakayama and Mie should not know that the Nankai Trough is loaded. The disagreement is much narrower than that. It's about the specific communicative act of issuing an advisory in response to a specific triggering event, and whether that specific act, as it's currently structured, does what it's meant to do. That's the real argument. It's not a conspiracy. It's a disagreement between two people who are both trying to keep the same coast alive and who have different theories about how to do it. I've spent the better part of this documentary telling you why the Nankai Trough is the most alarming near-term geophysical hazard on the planet. I've told you the number the Cabinet Office publishes. I've told you the probability the seismologists have assigned. I've told you what happened the last 2 times the fault broke, and I've told you why the interval since then places us inside the window in which it can happen again. That's the case, and the case is real, and I'm not going to soften any of it. But I owe you the other side, because the case for imminent catastrophe, as I've laid it out, is a compressed version of a much messier probability distribution, and there are people who look at the same numbers I've been quoting and reach a more measured conclusion, and their arguments deserve to be taken seriously. Here's the reversal. Here's the 10 minutes on why the worst-case scenario is not, in fact, the most likely near-term scenario, and why the relief that thought produces is real. The Nankai Trough's historical recurrence, as we've discussed, sits in a range. The typical interval between major earthquakes has been somewhere between 90 and 150 years. Some records suggest intervals as short as 90 and as long as 230, depending on which events you count and how you count them. The last full sequence completed in 1946. That places us, at the moment I'm recording this, at roughly 80 years into the interval, which is inside the window, but not at its peak. The Brownian passage time model, which is the statistical tool that most of these probability estimates are built on, treats the recurrence not as a fixed clock, but as a distribution. The probability of an event doesn't rise sharply at year 90 and stay high forever. It rises gradually, peaks somewhere in the middle of the plausible range, and then declines. Somewhere between now and roughly 2050 is where the model concentrates the highest probability density. That's not the same as saying it will happen in that window. It's saying that if it happens, that's when it's most likely to. And if it doesn't happen in that window, the probability doesn't disappear. It shifts. The Earthquake Research Committee, which is the body that publishes these estimates, has recently begun presenting them as dual ranges rather than as single numbers. In some analyses, the 30-year probability of a magnitude 8 to 9 event is cited as 60 to 90% or higher. In others, using different modeling assumptions, the estimate is 20 to 50%. That is not a small discrepancy. That is the difference between a hazard that is nearly certain and one that is merely likely, and the fact that both estimates are being published simultaneously by the same official body tells you something important about how much uncertainty is actually in the numbers. So the fault is not a rubber band, held at maximum tension, waiting to snap tomorrow. It's a probability distribution across decades. The most likely thing that happens between now and the end of this decade is that nothing happens. The most likely thing that happens between now and the end of the 2030s is that nothing happens. The Great Earthquake is a rare event on a human timescale, even when we are inside the window in which it can occur, and the honest presentation of the science acknowledges that. That is genuine relief. And I don't want to take it away from you, because it's true. But, and this is where the reassurance turns, and I want you to stay with me through this next part, because it's the piece that took me the longest to understand, and it's the piece I keep coming back to. The probability distribution I've just described, the Brownian passage time model that says the peak is somewhere between now and 2050, and the numbers are what they are, that model is calibrated to a specific kind of event. It's calibrated to the characteristic recurrence of partial segment ruptures. It's calibrated to the pattern we saw in the 1850s and in 1944 and 46. 2 or 3 of the segments break in sequence, spaced by hours or years, and the total energy release, though enormous, is distributed across multiple events. The full trough scenario is different. The full trough scenario is when all 4 segments break at once in a single continuous rupture, producing a single magnitude 9 earthquake and a single coordinated tsunami along the entire 700 kilometers of the trough at once. That's the event the Cabinet Office is planning around. That's the event the 298,000 figure is built on. And the historical record of that specific event is much thinner than the record of the partial segment ruptures. The 1707 Hoei earthquake is the clearest example. Before that, the record becomes ambiguous. Full trough events may occur on a multi-century cycle. They may be, in the language of the researchers, supercycle events, embedded within the ordinary rhythm of partial segment ruptures, but operating on their own longer timescale. And here's the uncomfortable part. The Brownian passage time probabilities you've been hearing, the 70% and the 80% and the 60 to 90%, may not accurately describe the probability of the full trough event. They describe the probability of a major Nankai earthquake, which is much more likely than not in the coming decades. But the specific catastrophic scenario, the one that generates the 298,000 deaths and the 2 million destroyed buildings, may be governed by a different clock. That clock may say the probability is lower. It may say the probability is much lower. The Cabinet Office is aware of this. They plan around the worst-case scenario anyway, and here's the language they've used to justify that choice, and I want to give it to you exactly as they've put it. Even though it may be unrealistic to adequately provide sufficient facilities and equipment to prepare for a massive earthquake and tsunami which may never eventuate, we still need to ensure that we set the assumptions without holding back. Read that again. It's a strange sentence, and I've been sitting with it for a while, and I want to try to say what I think it means. It means the government of Japan is aware that the number they're publishing may be higher than the number reality is going to deliver. They're aware that the worst-case scenario may not eventuate, and they're publishing the number anyway, because the alternative, publishing a lower number that turns out to be right in 99% of futures and catastrophically wrong in 1%, is not a policy choice they're willing to make. That is a defensible position. It might even be the correct position. But it means the 30-year probability you've been hearing and the death toll you've been hearing are answers to slightly different questions, and the difference between those questions matters. The probability that a great earthquake happens in the next 30 years is high. The probability that the specific great earthquake that kills 298,000 people happens in the next 30 years is lower. How much lower? Nobody quite knows. The Cabinet Office does not disagree. They publish it anyway because lower is not zero, and the scale of the consequence makes the arithmetic of preparation different from the arithmetic of prediction. So the reversal, the real one, is this. The Nankai Trough is loaded, and it will break, and the most likely time for it to break is within the lifetimes of most of the people who live along the coast today. That is true. But the specific catastrophic version, the coordinated full trough rupture, may be a rarer beast than the probability numbers suggest, and the near-term risk of that specific event may be genuinely lower than the numbers imply. And now the thing inside the relief that is worse. Because if the worst-case scenario is rarer than the probability framework captures, then, when it does happen, it happens in a system that has calibrated its preparation to the more common partial segment scenarios. The seawalls are sized for the tsunami they've seen. The evacuation routes are laid out for the wave heights that appear in the historical record, and a full trough event on a multi-century cycle is by definition an event whose parameters are not well constrained by the record. The 1707 Hoei event is one data point. One data point is not a distribution, it is a hint. The very rareness of the worst case, which is what makes it less likely in the near term, is also what makes the coast less prepared for the version of the event that does not fit inside the recent history. The reassurance and the worst thing are the same thing. The event that is unlikely to happen this decade is also the event that the infrastructure has, in some sense, forgotten how to imagine. Which raises a question, and I'm going to plant it here and let it sit, because it's a question I do not have an answer to, and I do not think anyone does. If the worst case number may be overstated as a near-term probability, but the worst case number is what the preparation is being built around, is that the right way to organize the response to this hazard? Or is there a version of the preparation, calibrated differently, that would save more lives across the full distribution of possible futures? I don't know. The Cabinet Office does not know. Horiuchi and Hirata are arguing about a much narrower version of that same question, and they don't know either. It's one of the genuinely open questions in disaster policy, and it's being worked out in real time by people who understand that they are, in a very literal sense, guessing. The woman on the Kochi train knows none of this. She knows the wave heights at every station. She knows where the towers are. She knows the 3 minutes she has. She is prepared for the event as it has been described to her, which is the event that generates the 298,000 figure, and if that event comes, she has a chance. If a different event comes, a partial rupture with a different tsunami geometry, a wave that arrives from an angle the models did not fully anticipate, she may still have a chance, because the training is generalizable, and the ground is the same ground. But somewhere in the space between what the instruments can hear and what the models can predict, and what the advisories can communicate, there is a version of the great earthquake that nobody has planned for, because it is not the version anyone has thought to plan for. And that is the version that is worth talking about next. The engine is not a metaphor. The Philippine Sea Plate is moving under the Amur Plate at a rate of 3 to 5 centimeters a year, and it has been doing this in one form or another for something on the order of 10 million years. That is not a forecast. That is a measured fact, taken from GPS stations bolted to the ground, and from the alignment of magnetic stripes on the seafloor, and from the geometry of the trench itself. The plates are converging. They will continue to converge. The energy of that convergence has to go somewhere, and where it goes, on a subduction interface that is locked and storing strain, is into elastic deformation that eventually releases as slip. The slip is the earthquake. The earthquake is not optional. There is no version of the physics where the Nankai Trough does not rupture again. The only questions are when and how much of the interface goes at once. That is the engine. It has no off switch and it takes no instructions. It does not care about the advisory system. It does not care about the seawalls. It does not care about the woman on the Tuesday train. And this is where the blindness begins. Donnet is a magnificent piece of engineering. Fiber optic cables running along the sea floor, seismometers and pressure gauges bolted to the ocean floor, sending continuous data back to shore stations in real time. HyNet, the land-based network, is one of the densest seismic arrays on the planet. Between them, they cover the Nankai Trough more thoroughly than any subduction zone has ever been covered in the history of the science. A magnitude 4 rupture on the fault interface would not go unnoticed. A slow slip event lasting weeks and moving the sea floor by a few millimeters a day would not go unnoticed. The instruments are extraordinary. The instruments also have a blind spot, and it is not a small one. To understand it, you need to understand a distinction that seismologists use when they talk about where on a subduction interface an earthquake actually slips. The plate boundary is not a wall, it's a slope. It dips down from the trench, which is the deepest point where the two plates meet at the sea floor, and it descends into the earth at an angle, going deeper and deeper as you move landward. The shallow part of that slope, the part closest to the trench, sits under thousands of meters of water. The deep part sits under the coast, and eventually under the land itself. For most of the last century, seismologists believed that the shallow part of the interface, the near trench zone, was not seismogenic. The sediments there were thought to be too soft, too wet, too weak to store strain. The prevailing view was that the shallow zone crept, that it slipped continuously and aseismically, and that the earthquakes happened deeper down, on the harder, more strongly coupled part of the interface. 2011 changed that. Paragraph 1. Unchanged. Flags are false positives. Real sentences with information, not rhythm fragments. The Tohoku earthquake, magnitude 9.1, ruptured almost the entire down-dip extent of the northern Japan Trench, and then it did something the models had not predicted. It kept going. It ruptured all the way to the trench, into the very shallow zone that had been assumed to be aseismic, and it produced tens of meters of slip in water depths exceeding 5,000 meters. That near-trench slip is what generated the tsunami that killed nearly 20,000 people. If the rupture had stopped where the models said it would stop, the wave would have been smaller. It didn't stop. And after Tohoku, seismologists everywhere had to go back and ask a question that had been treated as settled. Can the shallow part of the interface, the part right up against the trench, Slip in a great earthquake? For the Nankai Trough, that question is not academic. The near trench zone off the Kochi coast sits under water that is, in places, more than 4,000 meters deep. Instrumenting that zone is genuinely difficult. The cable infrastructure that carries Donet's signals back to shore is expensive to lay, expensive to maintain, and thins out as the water gets deeper and the seafloor gets more rugged. There are fewer sensors in the shallowest, outermost zone than there are further landward. That is not negligence. It is the physical difficulty of operating in 4 kilometers of water. But it means that if the next great Nankai rupture propagates all the way to the trench, in the way Tohoku did, the earliest and most tsunami-genic part of the slip may occur in the part of the interface that is least well instrumented. And here is why that matters, in the specific vocabulary of the 3-minute warning. Paragraph 2. The sirens sound, trains brake, phones buzz. Run is trailer cadence. Translate. The tsunami warning system works on speed. A seismometer detects the P wave, the fastest wave, which arrives first. The system computes an initial magnitude estimate and issues a warning, and the warning goes out, which means the sirens sound and the trains brake and the phones buzz. In a well-designed system, that whole chain takes under a minute. That leaves 2 minutes, at Kochi, for a person to get from where they are to a vertical evacuation tower or to high ground. Paragraph 3. The closing. It is bigger, it is faster, it is closer. Is verdict cadence? Translate while keeping every fact. Now consider a near trench rupture. The slip is happening in the shallowest part of the interface, close to the trench, in deep water, far from the coast. The seismic signal is real, but the initial magnitude estimate may undercall the actual size of the event because near trench slip radiates seismic energy less efficiently than deep slip. The earthquake is what seismologists call a tsunami earthquake, a term that means an event that produces a wave much larger than the shaking would predict. The warning goes out. It says magnitude 8. The actual event is magnitude 9. The tsunami arriving at the Kochi coast is not the wave the warning was calibrated for. It's bigger, it's faster, and it's already closer to shore than the model assumed. Paragraph 4. Pure rhythm-only fragment. Translate into a real spoken sentence. 90 seconds, maybe less than that. Paragraph 5. Unchanged. The flagged sentences are natural enumerations of real conditions, not drumbeat rhythm. That is the gap between the vertical evacuation tower being useful and not. A person who is elderly, or in a wheelchair, or carrying a child, or asleep, or in a bathroom, cannot cover the distance to the tower in 90 seconds from a starting position that assumed 3 minutes. The tower is real. The tower is engineered. The tower is where it needs to be. But if the physics of the specific event compresses the warning window, the tower may as well be on the moon for the people who cannot reach it. Paragraph 6. The not because opener is a written mirrored pair. Translate to speech. Nobody says this in the advisory coverage, and it isn't because anyone is hiding it. It's because the advisory framework, by design, communicates a general elevated probability, not a specific rupture geometry. The advisory cannot say, this time, if it happens, the slip will be shallow. The advisory does not know. Nobody knows. The rupture will do what the rupture does, and only after it is done will anyone be able to reconstruct exactly which part of the interface moved and by how much. By then, it is a post-mortem. And there is one more piece of the blindness, and this is the part that is genuinely hard to sit with. Paragraph 7. Unchanged. They cost enormous sums. They took years to build. they are not decorative, is a real enumeration about real infrastructure. The later, they will, clauses are genuine speech. Japan's coastal seawall program, expanded significantly after Tohoku, is a real and serious piece of infrastructure. Reinforced concrete walls, some over 10 meters high, stretch along vulnerable stretches of the coast. They cost enormous sums. They took years to build. They are not decorative. In a moderate tsunami, the kind that Japan sees on the order of once every few decades on any given stretch of coast, they work. They will slow the wave. They will reduce the inundation area. They will save lives. They will not stop a level 2 Nankai tsunami. The Cabinet Office has been explicit about this. The seawalls are calibrated to the level 1 scenario, an event of roughly 10-meter run-up with a return period on the order of decades to a century. The level 2 scenario, the worst case, is a wave in excess of 30 meters in the most vulnerable locations. A 10-meter wall against a 30-meter wave is not a defense. It is a temporary delay. The water will come over the top, and then it will keep coming, and then the wall itself becomes debris in the flow. Paragraph 8. Unchanged. Sentences carry distinct facts about a named source, not drumbeat. Which raises the harder question, and this is the version that a professor at the University of Tokyo, Kenji Satake, has put on the record. Quote, "It is not feasible to physically shield every home from such an event. That means evacuating sites and relocating critical facilities to safer ground." End quote. Satake is not a pessimist. He is a working scientist who has spent his career studying tsunami. He is saying, in the mildest possible language, that engineering alone cannot solve this. The only solution is to move. Paragraph 9. Unchanged. False positives. Natural spoken sentences. But the walls exist, and the walls, being tall and gray, and made of concrete, and visibly present, communicate something to the people who live behind them. They communicate protection. That communication is not accurate for the event the Cabinet Office is modeling, and there is a real concern, voiced by disaster researchers, that the presence of the walls may keep people closer to the waterline than they would otherwise choose to live, or may slow their evacuation response because the presence of the wall registers, subconsciously, as a form of security. The infrastructure built for the probable event may make the improbable event more lethal. That is the sentence I want to leave sitting there. I do not know how to solve it. I don't think anyone does. The alternative to building the walls is not building them, and then the moderate tsunamis, the ones that will happen, will do more damage than they need to. The alternative to trusting the walls is telling people not to trust them, which is what the Kuroshio evacuation program in fact does. But there are limits to how effectively any communication campaign can override the daily visual fact of a large concrete structure standing between a house and the sea. The gap between effort and outcome, in this specific case, is a gap the engineering cannot close. It can only be closed by something else. And what that something else is, and how much of it there needs to be, and who decides, is an argument that is being had, in Japanese, in offices in Tokyo and Kochi and Shizuoka, right now. The ferries are running. The Tosa Kuroshio Railway posted its Tuesday schedule this morning. A single-car train left the station on time and made its way down the coast, past the elevation signs, past the towers, past the seawalls. There were 8 or 9 people aboard, maybe 11. It was hard to tell from a distance. One of them was the woman we have been following, or someone very like her, someone who knows the wave heights at every stop and who has decided, on this Tuesday, as on every Tuesday, to make the trip anyway. Kuroshio town sits at an average waterfront elevation of about 3 meters above sea level. Its population, at the last census, was somewhere around 11,000. Its municipal disaster plan calls for full coastal zone evacuation in a projected 22 minutes. Laid against a 3-minute tsunami arrival window, that number is an act of administrative honesty that is almost hard to look at directly. Paragraph 10. Bare number fragments plus verdict aphorism. Translate while preserving both numbers and the point. 22 minutes at one end of the coast, 3 minutes at Kuroshio, and the gap between those two numbers is where the death toll lives. Paragraph 11. The not when the warning comes. Trio and the closing. The shaking is the warning. Everything else is a bonus. Are trailer/verdict shapes. Translate, keep the mantra intact. The town knows this. The people who live there know this. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is the reason Tomonaga Kimio, who runs a local project called Kurokan, describes the town's approach the way he does. Quote, "In Kuroshio, instead of preventing the effects of the giant tsunami, we are focusing on the mindset of preparedness. Our mantra is, when it shakes, evacuate." End quote. The mantra is deliberately simple. When it shakes, evacuate. Not when the warning comes, not when the sirens sound. When it shakes. Because the shaking is the earliest, most reliable, most local signal that a person will get. The shaking arrives before the wave, so the shaking itself is the warning, and everything else is a bonus. They have attended the drills. School children know the routes to the towers by heart. Old people who cannot walk quickly have been placed on registers so that neighbors know to come and get them. There are hand-drawn maps posted in community centers. There are practice runs several times a year with stopwatches. Kuroshio has been designated a special strengthening area for evacuation measures, which is a bureaucratic phrase that means the town has been singled out as a place where the ordinary planning is not enough and additional resources have been directed. And still, some of the people who live there have decided to stay. Paragraph 12. Unchanged. They can tell you. Sentences are genuine speech carrying specific facts, and the closing is a real calculation, not aphorism. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to romanticize this or to condescend to it. Neither would be right. The people who stay in Kuroshio, in the exposed coastal parts of Kuroshio, are not staying because they don't understand the risk. They understand the risk more completely than most people ever understand anything. They can tell you the wave height at their front door. They can tell you the elevation of their kitchen. They stay because the fishing boat is in the harbor, and the fishing boat is the livelihood. And moving the boat means moving the family. And moving the family means abandoning a grave that goes back 4 generations, or a house that has been in the family since before the Meiji Restoration, or a community that is the only community they have ever known. That is not ignorance. It is a calculation. It is a calculation made with full information about the 298,000 and about the 34 meters and about the 3 minutes. The calculation is that the probability of the great earthquake happening in any given year is low, and the value of the life that is being lived here, now, in this specific place, is high, and the arithmetic works out in favor of staying. The government probability estimate does not resolve that calculation. It cannot. A number expressed as a 30-year probability is not a decision-making instrument at the level of a single household on a single Tuesday. It is a policy input, a planning tool, a budgeting parameter. It is not an answer to the question, should I stay in the house my grandfather built? The answer to that question is being made by the people who live there, individually, in kitchens and on porches and over cups of tea. It is being made with love and with fear, and with a kind of practical grief that is not despair and not denial, but something older than both. Paragraph 13. Unchanged. The and they. Repetition is genuine speech, a deliberate rhythm of ordinary life, not trailer cadence. And they get on the Tuesday train, and they go to work, and they come home, and they cook dinner, and they check the emergency bag by the door, which is packed and has been packed for years, with the flashlight and the water and the family photographs in a waterproof sleeve. And they go to sleep, and in the morning they get up and do it again. That is what preparedness looks like, when preparedness alone cannot prevent the thing that is being prepared for. It looks like a life, lived attentively, inside a risk that has been named and measured and acknowledged, and then, deliberately, made room for. I don't have a lesson to draw from that. I don't think there is one. I think it is what human beings do when the choice is between leaving everything they love and staying with everything they love in a place where the ground can kill them. Most of them stay. Most of us would stay. That is not a failure of judgment. That is the shape of judgment itself when the stakes get high enough. There is one more thing. The advisory ended. On the 15th of August, 2024, at 5 in the afternoon, the Japan Meteorological Agency lifted the Nankai Trough earthquake extra information. 1 week after it had been issued. The elevated probability window had not closed. The instruments had not stopped detecting the strain. The trough was, and is, in exactly the state it was in when the advisory went up. What had changed in the intervening week was not the risk. It was the operational sustainability of the warning itself. Paragraph 14, the closing, everything is elevated, which is another way of saying nothing is a verdict aphorism, translate. The JMA said in its own careful language that maintaining the advisory indefinitely was not viable, which is a sentence that rewards sitting with. A permanent advisory is no advisory at all. If you tell people that the risk is elevated for a week, and then you tell them the same thing next week, and the week after that, and the week after that, eventually the words stop landing. The vocabulary erodes. The mechanism, which depends on distinguishing an elevated period from a normal one, ceases to be able to make that distinction because there is no normal period anymore. If everything is elevated, then, in practice, nothing is. So, the advisory came down, and the elevated probability window did not come down with it. The strain is still there. The plates are still converging. The instruments are still recording. The trough is still loaded. This is the part that made rechecking necessary. The advisory framework, as currently written, does not specify a defined threshold for reissuance. There is no rule that says, if a magnitude X or greater occurs on segment Y within Z years, a second advisory will automatically follow. The decision to reissue will be made, when it is made, by officials in a room, using their judgment, applying the protocols as they exist, weighing factors that the public will not see in real time. It's not a mechanical process, it's a human one. And the humans in that room have never done this before, because until August 2024, no advisory of this kind had ever been issued. Paragraph 15. The or on Tokai, or on Tonankai, or on Nankai proper. Run is trailer cadence. Translate, keep all 4 segment names. Somewhere between now and the actual megaquake, there will be another moment on the Hyuga-Nada segment, or on Tokai, or on Tonankai, or on Nankai proper. Some sequence of events will present itself, and a decision will have to be made about whether it warrants a second advisory. And the people making that decision will be applying a framework whose only precedent is 1 week in the summer of 2024 that ended in nothing. Paragraph 16. The not in the geology, not in the probability, in the room. Who is in it? Run is trailer cadence. Translate. That room is where the next chapter of this story lives. Not in the geology, which is settled, and not in the probability, which is a number, but in the room itself and in who is in it. What their mandate says, what their information looks like at 3 in the morning when the phone rings. What version of that room produces the wrong call, and what version produces the right one, and how anyone would tell the difference in advance. That's for another time. Paragraph 17. Unchanged. The DONET is there. HINET is there. Pair names 2 real instruments, and the evacuation towers. RUN is a real enumeration of real preparations. For now, the honest closing. The instruments are better than they have ever been. DONET is there. HINET is there. The GPS stations are recording sub-millimeter motions. The tsunami warning system is faster than it has ever been. The evacuation towers are built. The drills are run. The elevation signs are posted. The Cabinet Office has published the number, and the number is 298,000. And the state has told the public what the state believes, and Japan has, by any reasonable international measure, done more to prepare for this event than any nation on Earth has ever done to prepare for any natural hazard. And none of that changes the number. The number sits on the page in the Cabinet Office document, 298,000. It is the state's own estimate, produced by the state's own scientists, published by the state's own agency, endorsed by the state's own emergency planning apparatus. It is not a doomsayer's number. It is not an outlier. It is the median honest estimate of a government that has every institutional incentive to keep the number low and has chosen, deliberately, not to. Paragraph 18. Unchanged. False positive. It's a source attribution introducing a quote. The disaster management minister, Yoshifumi Matsumura, at the press conference when the August advisory was lifted, said this, quote, "It does not mean the risk has been eliminated." End quote. That is as clear as a state can be about a hazard it cannot prevent. Paragraph 19. The seawalls are built. The towers are built. The trains are calibrated. The school children know the routes. RUN is trailer cadence. Translate, keep every item. The question is not whether Japan is ready. Japan is as ready as it is possible to be. The seawalls are built, the towers are built, the trains are calibrated, and the school children know the routes. The old woman on the Tuesday train knows the wave heights at every stop, and she gets on the train anyway, because life is lived forward, and the probability of the great earthquake happening on any specific Tuesday is small, and she has decided. The question is whether ready is a thing you can be for this. I don't know. The Cabinet Office does not know. The seismologists do not know. The woman on the train does not know. What we know is the number. What we know is the physics. What we know is that the plates are moving, and the strain is accumulating, and the trough is loaded, and that somewhere in the years or decades ahead of us, on a morning that will be a normal morning until the moment it is not, the ground will move, and a wave will begin its journey across a stretch of ocean that has done this before, and the sirens will sound, and the trains will break, and the people who have prepared for their whole lives to run will run. Some of them will make it. That is the honest answer. That is where the science leaves us. That is where the state leaves us when the state is being honest, which the Japanese state, on this question, has chosen to be. The woman gets off the train at her station. She walks past the elevation sign. She goes home. The lights come on in the kitchen window. The kettle goes on the stove. The evening moves through its ordinary shape in a house that stands 3 meters above the level of a sea that has, before, come in. Somewhere out beyond the harbor, 4 kilometers down and 3 centimeters a year, The plates are still moving. They have not stopped since before there were people to notice. They will not stop tonight.